Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining and welcome to this webinar powered by WorkFlex. I hope everybody can hear me well. If anyone can confirm that in the chat, that would be highly appreciated. And of course, always feel welcome to let me know where you're dialing in from today. I myself am dialing in from not so sunny Amsterdam, cloudy Amsterdam, but yeah, look, still a very nice place. Thank you so much, Leilani. I'm going to give everybody one more minute to get their audio and visual in place. Rainy London, can imagine, unfortunate. And also to some other people, some late joiners to still join. Gothenburg, nice. Cloudy as well, though. You can't have it all, Frederick. All right, we're almost at 2 minutes past 11. Switzerland, thanks, Elia. Yeah, super lovely to have all of you here. Welcome again to this WorkFlex webinar. The fourth one even, in this series around the upcoming A1 reforms. Already did one in English. That's why you can still see here on the PowerPoint. May, it was, I think, 2 weeks ago by now. We did two in German as well. We had a lot of people joining those webinars, so it's definitely a topic that is of high interest for you. That's why you're here. Really great to have you. It's only just me. I feel a little bit lonely today, even though we have Liva, my colleague in the back, moderating if necessary and supporting you with any questions that you may have on the technicalities. Before you ask her, yes, this video is recorded, so you can also watch the recording afterwards. I feel a little bit lonely, like I said. We work with a lot of German colleagues, but it's a bank holiday in Germany. So yeah, we thought of doing this one just by myself. Who am I? For those of you who don't know me, Pieter Mande is my name, obviously a very Dutch name, born and raised here in the Netherlands. A steuerberater, so a tax lawyer by education. Used to work at PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, for quite some time, 13 years, 13, both in the Netherlands, in Germany, also for the global organization, always supporting large employers with their employer compliance in the global mobility space. My last role within PwC was a tax director within PwC Germany, responsible for the remote work proposition of PwC in Europe. But that's when they announced the Viato carve-out. I thought it was a great idea, but I didn't want to be a part of it. And I carved out myself and started, together with Patrick Koch, a German guy, we started WorkFlex around 5 to 6 years ago now. And WorkFlex is doing pretty good so far. It's an exciting journey. I'll tell you a little bit more about what we do, but obviously still in the global mobility area, but a lot of focus on technology. So one of the co-founders, and my responsibility entirely lies with the compliance of our platform. So before we go to the housekeeping rules, quickly going through the agenda. Looks like a lot, but don't worry, we'll easily manage in time, because a lot of the things we'll go through fairly quickly, but just to make sure that everybody of you gets to the same, let's say, level of base understanding before we start talking about the upcoming or not upcoming adjustments. So first, we're going to quickly talk about what is an A1 certificate at all. The EC regulations 883 and 987, basically the regulations where these A1 documents originate from. The amendment procedure that is now closing its end, but it was already started in 2016, as you can see here. The current status and my personal expectations for these for this amendment procedure. Then, of course, full focus on what are now actually these suggested A1 changes of that amendment procedure, and Q&A. That brings me to the housekeeping rules. Look, we've got some time for Q&A at the end, but even though I love to hear myself speak, I'm here for you. We're doing this webinar for you and for no one else. So if you have any questions in the meantime, please just raise them. You can do this in two ways. You can just use the chat. Some people already found it. We see the sun is shining in Finland. Lovely. Thanks for sharing, Lara. You can use that chat for questions. I'll try to keep an eye on it. But like I said, my colleague Liva is also there to ping those questions to me if I miss them. Also on your right bottom, you should be able to see a questions button. It's basically another chat, but you're also totally free to raise your questions there at all times. I may park them, I may pick them up right away, but really feel free to raise or to put any questions in there that you have around this topic. All right, let's get into it. We've got 45 minutes, a little bit less than 40 minutes left. And like I said, we should easily make it in time. All right, just to bring everyone to the same level. What is an A1 certificate actually? Well, they look like at least a part of the document on the left-hand side of this slide. An A1 certificate is a certificate confirming the continued Social Security coverage of an employee, even when this person is temporarily working from abroad. So usually you request it as an employer. Of course, WorkFlex does that on behalf of its clients, and it's then issued by the Social Security authorities or the health insurance company of the home country, the country of employment. So in my case, we would apply for an A1 certificate with the Social Security authority here in the Netherlands. It's different how you do this and where exactly you do this. It's always in the home country, of course, or in the Social Security country. But yeah, different authorities are appointed as the relevant point of contact. So like I said, in the Netherlands, we're talking Social Security authorities. In the UK would be rather the tax authority doing this as well. In Germany, we're talking the insurance companies. So that differs a little bit, and definitely also the process of how to apply for such an A1 differs quite strongly, let alone the duration, the time it takes those authorities to issue then the A1. We or you can only apply for an A1. The actual certificate is issued by the authority. In Germany, it goes pretty fast. In Switzerland, it goes pretty fast. In the UK, it goes a little bit slower. In the Netherlands, it goes really slow. But then there's definitely also countries where it takes months and months. And that's, for instance, Norway is a country, an example. So every A1 is a COC, but not every COC is an A1. In case you don't know what a COC is, it's a certificate of coverage. It's basically the same as an A1. Like I said, every A1 is a COC. So every A1 is a certificate of coverage. However, there's also other COCs, and we call those just simple COCs. What's the difference? And today we're talking about A1s. Those are COCs within the EU region with some additional countries. But as soon as one of the two countries, the home country or the destination country of the trip, is outside that European region, we're talking a COC. And none of the things that I'm talking about today is related to those COCs. We're only really talking about A1s. So if we're talking a trip from Germany to the US or from the US to the Netherlands, irrelevant. We're talking COCs in those cases. None of the adjustments we're talking about today are relevant for those. All right. So now the EC regulations, where this A1 story actually originates from. There's two. 883 2004 on the coordination of Social Security across the EU. That's a very well-known EC regulation. You've probably come across it in your career. But then there's this second one. It's actually the real one where A1s come from. It's 987 2009, and that's the implementing regulation for that previous EC regulation. So 883, it coordinates the Social Security, and 987 actually implements the measures. And Article 15 of that second EC regulation, you can see here on the slide, introduces the A1, not only the A1 application and the A1 certificate. You can see it here underlined in yellow, that a person concerned, it's usually more the employer, like I told you before, shall inform the competent institution of a member state whose legislation is applicable thereof, whenever possible, in advance. And so that's the A1 application. You're going to ask your Social Security authority, please confirm that I'm going to be covered by, in my case, the Dutch Social Security, even though I'm going to work in Germany or Italy or Spain for some time. And then the A1 certificate there is actually that statement issued by that member state, make available information concerning this legislation that's applicable to that person concerned. So this is where the A1 originates from, EC Regulation 987/2009. Interesting fact, you already see 2004 versus 2009. There's nothing less than a 5-year gap between the coordination regulation and the actual implementation thereof. Don't forget about this, because we will refer back to it a little bit later. All right. We're talking adjustments around the A1. Now we know what an A1 is and where they originate from. This is the amendment procedure that is currently, let's say, reaching headlines in the media. So we're talking an amendment procedure to change the aforementioned EC regulations 883 and 987. And the objective was to modernize EU law on Social Security and facilitate administrative simplicity and enforceability of the rules. So the simple name of this amendment procedure already shows you that this is not a very new amendment procedure. It was already initiated 10 years ago in 2016. But now, finally, only a month ago, a little bit more than that, there's news. We're reaching the end of this procedure because there has been a provisional agreement reached. And that's why you've seen headlines, you've seen LinkedIn blowing up over the topic. And this webinar is exactly meant to share you what's really in that amendment procedure, the status of this amendment procedure, and of course, what's going to change. Right, so the current status is that a provisional agreement has been agreed upon between, let's say, representatives of the member states, and that's then done in a specific committee. So it's not the entire parliament or not the entire council, not all the countries were involved, but it's a committee, and most key countries were involved, definitely. So it looks very good, but the European Parliament and the Council still need to adopt now the amendment proposal. This is scheduled for not an exact date, but this will probably take place in the next month, 2 months. But this procedure did not take 10 years for no reason. We've already been at the exact same point earlier, I think it was 2019, but then it actually failed to be adopted by the European Parliament and Council. It was basically shot back. And so, it shows this is not an easy topic. Don't want to go too much into detail right away, but there's quite a strong difference for, let's say, A1 in practice for the different countries. There's a good group of countries that don't really do much with it because they're receiving travelers. They're not really sending out too many travelers. But there's a couple of countries that are sending out. They're doing a lot of international business and they're issuing A1s and they're paying for coverage, even though their people are working from abroad. And they have a very different interest from this whole setup than the other countries. And so it's quite a difficult topic for all the countries to agree upon. So it's not done yet. But the good news, I think, is, look, they may be a little bit slow in Brussels and Strasbourg, but they're not stupid, right? So if you've already failed at this exact point with this amendment procedure, and you're now having a go at it again, I'm personally quite confident that behind the scenes, the people pushing this amendment have definitely done their job and have made sure that all the key countries have actually already reached out to the people behind them saying, look, are we going to be okay with this proposal right now in this setup or not? And that they only agreed to this provisional provisional agreement, knowing that the ones that are actually going to vote for it later will also adopt. So I think overall, the likelihood of this amendment proposal now going to be adopted in the near future is definitely above average. So what then happens if if the European Parliament and Council adopt the proposal? Well, unlike directives, EC regulations have a direct legislative effect. So they do not need to be translated into local law. It will be an immediate law directly applying to the European people, basically. They also come into force relatively soon. You're talking a few months after the adoption, but a very big one. There's a difference between coming into force and actually coming into application. And already for the A1 adjustments that we're going to talk about today, but that you've seen flying around, they will not apply for at least another 24 months after the into force date of these amendments. There's basically an implementation period of 24 months foreseen, so 2 years to implement the new adjusted rules and processes. And that brings me back to that previous one, because you've heard the word implementation before. 883, EC Regulation 883, was agreed upon in 2004, but it was not implemented until 2009, a 5-year gap. It's quite likely that this application or this implementation period of 2 years will also be extended. So yeah, there's good news. I think this amendment proposal is going to be adopted. However, before we actually see the adjustments going live into practice, it's a whole different story. We're talking years and years, and it's very likely that those 2 years will be extended to 5 years, maybe even 6+ years, what we've seen now for the implementation of this very famous but not applicable process yet, the ETIAS here in Europe. So that's the current status and the expectations. Again, if you have any questions, I already saw some questions on the slide popping on left and on my right. If you have any questions around this topic, just raise them here. I'll try to address them right away. All right, we have reached the core part of this session, the suggested A1 changes. We've bucketed them into 3, basically. And you've seen it. Short trips will not require an A1 certificate, and that is true. Trips with a total duration of no more than 3 consecutive days of work in a time period of 30 consecutive days will be exempted from the A1 certificate obligation. So you can already see that it kind of is nice, but at the same time, immediately a little bit complex. And I guess that balancing game we see everywhere with legislators. Of course, they want simplification. At the same time, it is very difficult to make simple legislation, apparently. And so there's immediately this complexity of, okay, consecutive days of work in this period of 30 days. What does it actually mean? So it's not entirely clear what it means today. But of course, for the majority of trips, it will be fairly simple, right? If someone goes on a trip 2 days just to a conference or to whatever, and there's no repetition of that trip or so, it's all good. That trip is exempted from the A1 obligation. However, if someone goes on a trip to that same country after that, okay, then it becomes a little bit different. Then you have to start counting. So you definitely have to do 2 things. You have to start tracking your trips if you did not do this already. And in certain cases, you have to start counting. Consecutive days of work is, I think, quite clearly, right? Consecutive, so Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, for instance, and days of work. When does a day actually qualify as a day of work? Based on other legislation in the same area, you're probably looking at as soon as even one email was answered on that day, we're talking a day of work. We're probably not going to see that it needs to be at least 4 hours or something like that. In the, let's say, the commuter area, compliance heavy area between Germany and the Netherlands, or Belgium and France, and Switzerland and France, etc., a day of work is usually counted as soon as a little bit of work is done. And then these 30 consecutive days implies, or it's quite obvious if you then would go on another trip and you would exceed those 3 days, that all of a sudden the trip is no longer exempted. A pretty obvious difficulty would be that retrospectively, that first trip is also not exempted from the A1 obligation. And that's difficult because we'll also see later on that the A1 obligation will actually be to apply for an A1 beforehand. So if you only find out that you have to apply for an A1 afterwards, how are you going to comply? So it's a little bit tricky on how this is actually going to play out, because you can't look into the future always, and may only find out, like I said, the A1 would be obligatory after the trip has already taken place. So yes, a very big relief. At the same time, a little bit of complexity added, because you will definitely have to track your trip and you have to count under some conditions. I see a question coming up. Many travelers post that work or assume planned travel. How should we manage compliance when work is unplanned and urgent? Swedish employee being sent to Denmark at short notice for a customer emergency. What level of compliance is realistic? What documentation should be done afterwards? Jenny, thank you so much. A very good question. I'll park it a little bit and discuss it when we're at the third suggested change. It's a very good question. Thank you again for sharing. If there's any other questions, just please put them in and I'll address them when the moment is appropriate. So for this first exemption, the construction sector is entirely excluded. Why is that? Because, well, what data has shown the EU legislator is that this is a sector where there's relatively a lot of fraud taking place in the social security area. And of course, also a sector where there's quite a need for social security because of, well, sometimes even heavy accidents, but at least many accidents taking place requiring care to whatever extent. So that's why they said, look, for this exemption, the construction sector is entirely excluded. What is the construction sector? Basically, every trip related to buildings, construction. That's the summary, I think. All right. The second exemption. Business trips will not require a A1 certificate. You might think, well, didn't we just discuss that? No, it's different. So every short trip, those 3 days, is exempted. If the trip is longer, but still qualifies as a business trip, it would still be exempted as well. So more good news, I would say. It's only for qualifying business trips, however. So what is happening now in the amendment proposal, they're introducing the definition of a business trip. And those business trips, or if trips that match that the definition, are exempted regardless their duration. The definition basically says, yeah, look, you have to qualify and there's a specific trip purpose. They say a couple of examples. For instance, they say as soon as there's providing of services involved during the trip, it will not be a business trip. So it comes a little bit from the PWD, posted worker notifications area, that as soon as you're providing services, you will require an A1 unless the trip is really short. But then it's simply not a business trip, so should not fall under this second exemption. It's also clear that workations also do not qualify as business trips. So you would still require an A1 for those if they take longer than 3 days. Again, that's first exception. Why is that? Well, because workations are not initiated, or they're not on the employer behalf, but on the employee's behalf. And that's a condition for a trip to qualify as a business trip. It needs to be initiated by the employer. It also gives that definition. It also gives a few examples of trips that would qualify as a business trip. You see that here at the last bullet. So we're talking meetings, whatever that is, internal or external. It just says meetings. Events, conferences, they would all qualify as business trips. So again, good news, because as soon as your trip qualifies as a business trip, you don't even have to look at the duration. You're all good. Again, a little bit of bad news, because yeah, you have to start tracking. You may have to count, but first now here you have to make this assessment. Does this trip qualify as a business trip? Yes or no? And yes, the definition gives a couple of examples, but it's only just a couple of examples and nothing much more. So yeah, you'll have to again track the trips and assess the trip purpose. in order to make sure that you're doing the right thing. And the right thing is very important, because then we end up at the last suggested change here. A1s today are widely considered a nice to have because of that text. If you remember from one of the earlier slides, you do them preferably upfront, but you can technically also request for A1 certificates nowadays with a retrospect effect. So if a trip already took place, an A1 audit comes up or a social security audit comes up, and you didn't get the A1 yet, you can ask for it retrospectively. It's preferred you apply for them beforehand, but it's not a hard obligation. And that will change. So a very big adjustment as well is this preferably upfront goes to a mandatory upfront obligation for an A1 certificate. So yes, there's an exception for short trips. Yes, there's an exception for business trips, but for all other trips, you are obliged to request for an A1 upfront. That brings me to your question, Jenny. Yes, if a trip comes up super short noticed, bad news, you're still going to have to do this. The good news is the text of the newly proposed law, it doesn't say that you need to have obtained the A1 beforehand. And well, in Sweden, it also definitely takes a little bit of time. Fortunately, all around Scandinavia, it takes quite some time for the authorities to issue an A1. So if it's a very short notice, unplanned trip, you're unlikely to get the A1 in time. That's not the problem. The problem is you still need to do the application upfront. Of course, well, look, you can do that relatively fast. We at WorkFlex, we always apply for A1 certificates literally within hours after the trip was submitted on our platform. So we can do it super fast. And I think, Jenny, that definitely allows still for unplanned short notice trips. If you look at the other compliance requirements, Jenny, for instance, a PWD notification, it would for us, it would be the same. We do them very fast, but it's usually a bit more complex. And that's why it might be extra tricky for unplanned short notice trips to be compliant in that area. And it definitely is the case if you need a visa, right? Sometimes it just doesn't work. Within the EU region, that will hardly be the case. But if you're also talking trips to countries outside the EU region or trips by non-EU citizens, yeah, that might be a little bit trickier. And it is, to be honest, simply a matter of computer says no, right? Without a visa, you will not be able to enter the country or work there. There are also some country specific. So for instance, in the Scandinavian countries, you've got these HSE cards, like special healthcare cards, or in Norway, you're talking D number registrations. Yes, that always takes a little bit more time. That's not scope of the amendment here just now, but Jenny, that is already a tricky part. Well, that's exactly why WorkFlex exists, right? So it is complex. It is sometimes difficult to do it in time. We're pros at it. So it should still be possible, especially if there's a visa playing around. That might be a little bit difficult. So that question we now answered. Quickly go back to the chat as well. Don't see any new questions that popped in. So we'll just get on with this one. Like I said, any questions are more than welcome. I think we're good in time. That's also what you get if you're doing it all just by yourself. All right. So we've talked about the three main adjustments, just repeating them a little bit in not the prettiest flow, I have to admit. But we've tried making it simpler and struggled a little bit. I think this is the right way of visualizing the adjustments or the process in the future. So first question that you have to ask yourself for every trip: are we talking max 3 consecutive days of work in a consecutive period of time of 30 days? If yes, you would go to an A1 certificate exemption unless you're in the construction sector. If the trip is longer, you've got a second opportunity of being exempted, namely if the trip legally qualifies as a business trip. So for instance, there's no service provision. Does that trip qualify as an A1 as a business trip? Yes, you're also still exempted. Important to note, and you can see that here with the arrow in the middle, the construction sector might be exempted from that first, or might be excluded from that first exemption. So short trips would still be A1 mandatory, but they're not excluded for that second option. So also business trips in the construction sector could be exempted. For instance, if people from the construction sector just go to a conference or a webinar as well. Does the trip last a little bit longer than 3 days in a 30-day period? And does it not qualify as a business trip? Then you go into the right bucket, A1 obligation. So not a nice to have, an absolute need to have. All right, so what does this mean? Overall, as you can see, and I've already mentioned it a little bit, these changes, they're great news, but they're also a little bit annoying because it does imply, and it does require you to start tracking your trips. Your travel team probably already does this, but maybe doesn't exist within your company. And what we see a lot is that HR and or GM Global Mobility is quite often not even aware of the business travel that is taking place. You'll have to be aware of that in the future. You have to start tracking your trips. Of course, WorkFlex, we connect with booking platforms, and for trips that are not booked through a platform, employees can just simply submit them themselves on WorkFlex. So that's a great tracking tool, but not every one of you might be using WorkFlex yet. So you have to start figuring out a process. We're happy to welcome you as a customer, of course, though. But that's topic number one. You have to start tracking your trips. For that first exception, like I said, you have to start counting individually per trip, but especially also accumulated, looking back and forth in a probably running 30-day period. By the way, what do I mean with a running 30-day period? It says in a 30 consecutive period. It could be from trip one only going into the future, but it's quite logical looking again at similar legislation in the area, the 183-day rule. It's quite likely that you have to count these 30 days on a running basis. So always going 30 days back and 30 days to the future. You have to track, you have to count individually and accumulative. For that second exemption, yes, you have to assess each trip's purpose to figure out whether we're talking a business trip, yes or no. And lastly, after tracking, counting, and assessing, you have to actually do the application. Like I said, it's no longer a nice to have, it's a need to have. You need to make sure you give your traveler a confirmation of the A1 application on his or her trip. So quite some to-dos all of a sudden. And like I said before, that is something that we've seen quite commonly in legislation, right? They try to make it nicer, simpler. As you remember, the obligation of the objective of the amendment period was to simplify. At the same time, legislators struggle with making things simpler. And secondly, remember also another objective of this amendment procedure was to enable the authorities more to enforce the legislation as well. Before we go to this one, because I want to say a couple more words around this enforcement. The expectation is, yes, you will have to do less A1 applications. However, if you have to do them, you really must do them. There will be a system of information sharing across the various governments or authorities. And so it is the expectation that the enforcement of the rules, which today, let's be honest, is hardly there, will dramatically increase. We've actually seen the enforcement already increase over the past months. Many, many more Social Security and PWD audits going on. But you, of course, also know that even though it was taking a lot longer for the ATIAS to go live, it will go live. And it's also simply a enforcement opportunity for the authorities. All of a sudden, they know from exactly every traveler when this person comes in, goes out, etc. Just like in the UK now. So there is no flying under the radar anymore. So enforcement will drastically go up. Yeah, you've already seen this. I do want to go back to a couple of slides earlier. This is only the case if the amendment goes through unchanged. You never know what happens. And it will not apply for another 2 years. So it does give you time to prepare for this. Of course, what we see quite a lot is that as soon as a EC regulation has been adopted, authorities, and as a result also companies, are, let's say, conforming to that adjusted rules already. And so they are already putting processes in place. They might already increase the enforcement. And so, yes, don't just sit and wait, but start preparing right now. Make sure you already start tracking, start counting, start assessing, and preferably also just do the application. At least if you're using WorkFlex, it's not a lot of work. I see a question coming in from Monica. Thank you so much for raising it. How will enforcement work in practice? Will travelers be asked at border control? Probably. There's various ways. Of course, look, if you are scanning your passport, you know who's coming in. There are companies that are shooting rockets to the moon and making them land back on their feet. I think it's much simpler to connect the dots and check for Monica, for whether there is a A1 application, and the country where it was issued from or where it should have been done should be able to let the destination country know, is there an A1 application in the system? So it could be that you're immediately denied at entering the country. Look, even though it might on paper be a lot simpler to do this compared to launching a rocket and making it land back on its feet, due to data privacy and due to governments being governments, I wouldn't expect every individual to be checked for Social Security specifically. But what you'll see is indeed more Social Security employees walking around on airports checking. And as soon as the computer says no to whatever topic, there will be a much more abundant review. Also, logically, what you'll see is in the national Social Security audits, the auditors asking for, look, do you have a process for A1s? They might not even ask for all the A1s, but it's a very clear indicator of your compliance. Are you doing A1 applications? Are you doing PWD assessments and notifications? Do you have a process in place? And if you're answering no, especially in the Netherlands, it's a very great way. It was quite new, like since the last 10 years or so. They're not necessarily looking at the outcome, but they're looking at, do you have the process in place? Because if you do, and there's awareness, then the outcome, I don't have to check it, it should be there. So there's various ways, Monica, how the enforcement will take place in practice. And of course, worst case would happen is that there's actually an accident taking place and your employee wants support in any way, and not the computer says no, but the medical support would say no. So yeah, there's also quite a big risk of really getting into a zone where you don't want to be in, especially knowing that you do see quite a couple of tasks here on the slide. On the other hand, if we stick to the example of shooting rockets to the moon, landing them back on their feet, it is not rocket science to track your trips, to count the presence, single and accumulated, to assess the trip purpose and do the application. So I would highly recommend basically not waiting for the answer to the question, well, how well is that enforcement going to be? Just make sure you're compliant. It's probably a lot easier and a great peace of mind and a great show of your employer duty of care for your people as well. Sure thing, Monica, thanks for raising the question. We've reached the end of my slides. I'm looking at the chat. I didn't see any new questions coming in. I'll summarize really quickly, and if there's no other questions, we can say goodbye after that. So like I said, we're talking adjustments. Yes, two big exemptions, short trips and business trips. However, not for everyone, the construction sector. It is for most others, but you'll still have to count and assess and track. And most importantly, look, this is only the case if the amendments goes through. above average that likelihood, but then it will still take a lot of time, 2, 3, 4 years. So yes, you just stick to it right now. There's no exemption. You do your A1 applications right now. If you're not doing them yet, start preparing, because you will have to do them in a few years from now. And definitely keep an eye on our LinkedIn, the WorkFlex page, or on my personal LinkedIn to see any updates in this area. I thank you very much for joining. I didn't see any new questions coming in, so I hope it was clear. I hope you liked it. Thank you very much for being here. If there's any updates on this topic, you'll see them flying around, and we would love to welcome you to another WorkFlex webinar in the near future. Thank you so much.